Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. And you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 35, episode 7, Hanoi Hero, James Bond Stockdale. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is, of course, a regular writer on here and a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. It is a rare thing that a man be awarded his country's highest award for bravery because of his actions as a prisoner of war, but that is exactly why Air Wing Commander James Stockdale was singled out. He was the highest-ranking U.S. prisoner of war during Vietnam from 9th of September 1965 until 12th of February 1973, and was awarded the Medal of Honor for his unrelenting bravery in the Hanoi Hilton. James Bond Stockdale, his middle name was his mother's maiden name, joined the U.S. Naval Academy as a 20-year-old in 1943. After serving on several vessels, he was accepted for flight training in 1949, completing it in 1954. In 1959, he was sent to Stanford University as a 38-year-old naval pilot to study for a master's degree in international relations. There, in his final year at university in 1962, Stockdale became interested in philosophy, and especially in the ancient philosopher Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher of the 1st and 2nd century AD. Stockdale had been in the Navy for more than 20 years already, and had, he recalled, scarcely left the cockpit. Encouraged by one of his professors, Stockdale read the Enchiridion of Epictetus, a handbook of Stoic behaviour written in the 1st century AD, and it would shape forever after his thoughts and deeds. No matter where he was stationed, by his bedside was a copy of Epictetus, a copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, a more accessible account of Socrates' life than that contained in Plato's dialogues, and copies of Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Stockdale credited Epictetus with changing his life and later with his survival. Stockdale then undertook what he called 3 7-month cruises to the waters off Vietnam as the commander of Fighter Squadron 51, flying F-8 Crusaders and A-4 Skyhawks. He participated in the first ever bombing raid on North Vietnam on August 5, 1964, flying off the Essex-class aircraft carrier USS Ticonderoga CV-14. The first bombing raid on North Vietnam was in retaliation for the Gulf of Tonkin incident. After the attack on the USS Maddox on August 2, 1964, and where Stockdale flew an F-8, one of 4, which attacked the 3 Vietnamese P-4 torpedo boats involved in the attack. He was also in the air during the second incident on August 4th, when it was reported that another attack by torpedo boats was made. Stockdale recorded, however, that there were no targets. The US Navy was shooting at phantoms. Later, as a POW, he feared he might reveal that secret, but never did. The raids ordered on August 5th were in retaliation for the attack on August 4th. Stockdale's response: retaliation for what? During his third tour in 1965, Stockdale was involved in daily sorties as Air Wing Commander, flying off the Essex-class carrier USS Oriskany, CV-34, the Mighty O. On September 9th, 1965, Stockdale recalled that he flew at 500 knots right into a flak trap at treetop level. On fire, it was impossible to steer the plane. Its control system had been shot away. Stockdale ejected. He later recalled that he whispered to himself that he was entering the world of Epictetus. He thought he would be a prisoner for at least 5 years. He would actually be a POW for 7.5. Epictetus's teachings shaped how he would deal with his incarceration and the inhuman treatment he would be subjected to. Those teachings were essentially keeping those things within his control and those things beyond his control separated within his mind. This and many of Epictetus's other precepts Stockdale would put into effect as a POW in Ho Lo Prison, Hanoi, most commonly referred to as the Hanoi Hilton. As he descended by parachute, the North Vietnamese troops on the ground began shooting at him. When he landed, he was set upon and had his leg broken before the crowd was called off him by an officer. Before he had landed, he knew that there would be many things to come which would be out of his control. As a student of Epictetus, he would be tested to the extreme. Stockdale knew he was going to become a POW, and he was determined to behave differently to those men whose experiences he had seen reported in the aftermath of the Korean War, when, as POWs themselves, it had been every man for himself. Stockdale was determined that he would behave differently and keep faith with his fellow prisoners, in keeping with Article 4 of the Fighting Man's Code of Conduct, written in 1955 in the aftermath of the Korean War. The code also stated that a US soldier should give no information or take part in any action which might be harmful to his comrades. As a senior officer, and Stockdale would be the most senior, he should take command, and the chain of command was to be observed by American POWs. Here began the stoic and brave thoughts and actions which would lead to his eventually being awarded the Medal of Honor. Although he eventually gained access to crutches, Stockdale's leg never healed properly, and he was treated poorly, brutally, as were his fellow POWs. His rank was never recognized by his captors, but he took command of 50 fellow pilots and navigators, calling them backseat electronic wizards in Ho Lo. That number grew to more than 400 as the war progressed. Before any POW saw another American, all were subjected to a torture Stockdale called taking the ropes. This involved being bound with tourniquet-type ropes with hands behind, body jackknifed forward and down towards the ankles, which were held secure in lugs attached to an iron bar. This method stopped the circulation in the upper body and caused excruciating pain, as well as a feeling of ever-increasing claustrophobia. In this state, men could be made to give answers to almost any question asked. The procedure could be repeated at any time, and often, during captivity, and was only one of the techniques of torture used on POWs. It was during such sessions that POWs were made to confess their crimes, often taped or filmed for use by their enemies. Sessions of isolation often followed this treatment for men to contemplate their crimes and repent. These processes were repeated often. The idea that once broken, a prisoner would not be subjected to such treatment again, or that the jailers would become bored of dishing out such treatment, were fallacies. The breaking of any rule, of which there were many and which were often petty, would result in interrogation. Stockdale was interrogated daily. Such crimes were called black activities. Stockdale later reflected that the repercussions of such treatment were much more damaging based on how the men saw themselves afterwards, judging themselves on how they had behaved and what they had said rather than any long-lasting physical damage. Feelings of guilt and of betraying themselves, their country, and their fellows, or indeed of everything they stood for, were the most damaging. A broken limb was nothing in comparison. Stockdale was well aware that he would lose control on occasion under questioning. His response to those situations, contemplating what he was in control of, allowed him to recover. One form that Stockdale's leadership of the POWs took was the shape of rehabilitating men after such treatment, when they felt like traitors to themselves, their country, and their fellows. Later he would say that the men who didn't make it out of Vietnam were the optimists, those who thought rescue, or the war's end, was imminent. They often died of broken hearts when their brutal treatment continued interminably. The captors wanted the prisoners to repent for their crimes and show shame, bowing to all in authority. These desires of the captors were resisted as much as possible. Some resistance was active. Stockdale led a riot to get the prisoners out of leg irons. It resulted in him spending a year in isolation. The prisoners organized an illegal method of communication using a tap code, whereby the alphabet was organized into 5 groups of 5 letters, C and K occupying the same space, and the tap indicated which group and which letter in the group. This too was a device from ancient history. The method was first described by the historian Polybius in the 2nd century BC. The tap code allowed the prisoners to communicate, but also to resist their tormentors as well as a form of society within the prison. The tap code was used to order men to undergo torture processes or to refuse to comply with the demands of their captors, both designed to frustrate the men who held them. Following such orders, despite knowing the consequences, also allowed the POWs to have some control over their situation. It was them in control of choosing to be tortured, not the people torturing them. Stockdale later called this my kind of stoicism, where the prisoners were the masters of their own fate. Stockdale issued his orders via the tap code, often as acronyms, in order to minimize the number of letters and taps required, as well as to offer a layer of security to the meaning of the message. One of the most common orders was "back us." Don't bow in public, stay off the air, admit no crimes, never kiss them goodbye. Us could be interpreted as United States, but it really meant unity over self. Stockdale encouraged togetherness, that all of the prisoners were in this together. Even when put on film, some American airmen began to use double meanings in their sentences, gestures and practical jokes to thwart and shame their captors. A few American POWs, less than 5%, remained aloof from this society, never learned the tap code, and chose to remain loners. These men were known as finks. When back in the States, Stockdale attempted to have 2 of them put on trial for their complicit behavior with the captors, but the government refused. Although the commander, Stockdale had a cohort of 10 others who helped him lead the prisoners. These were not necessarily all men of high rank, but consisted of those who refused to quit trying to be our brother's keepers. These men were eventually isolated and singled out for especially harsh treatment to try and break the will of the remainder of the prisoners. Most were subjected to 3 years solitary confinement, others to 4. Stockdale was of the opinion that long-term isolation was more effective at breaking a man's will than torture. although some who experienced less solitary isolation disagreed and placed torture as a more sure method. In the autumn of 1969, at the end of his 4th year as a POW, Stockdale was caught with a note communicating to another prisoner. Knowing it contained information which could be used to break other prisoners, and aware that prisoners had been killed in purges or where torture was taken too far, Stockdale decided to take personal action. Left alone in the main torture room, it was the night before the day Stockdale had been told he would talk. Stockdale remembered that Ho Chi Minh had just died, September 2nd, 1969. Sitting in a chair in leg irons, Stockdale was able to douse the light and wiggle the chair over to the window, the only one with paned glass in the prison. He smashed the window and slashed at his wrists with the shards of glass. The guard found him passed out in a pool of his own blood, barely breathing. Stockdale's Medal of Honor citation stated that he had risked his life while a POW, leading resistance to interrogation and refusing to participate in propaganda exploitation. The incident which most impressed this attitude on his captors was this deliberate self-disfiguration, self-inflicting a near-fatal wound which convinced his captors of his willingness to give up his life rather than capitulate, and make himself a symbol of resistance regardless of personal sacrifice. The guard sounded the alert, summoned their doctor, and he saved Stockdale's life. The realization that Stockdale was willing to sacrifice himself led to the better treatment of all the US POWs. Stockdale was revived in a room full of high-ranking North Vietnamese officers. He later wrote that prison torture as they had known it ended that night in Hanoi. His Medal of Honor citation stated, "By his heroic actions at great peril to himself, he earned the everlasting gratitude of his fellow prisoners and of his country." The opening of his citation makes clear how remarkable Stockdale's circumstances were. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, while senior naval officer in the prisoner of war camps of North Vietnam. It recognized that Stockdale's valiant leadership and extraordinary courage in a hostile environment sustain and enhance the finest traditions of the US Naval Service. It was not until after the war that Stockdale learnt that his wife, Sybil, had been making demands weekly in Paris for the better treatment of US POWs. She was on international news broadcasts, and as the wife of James Stockdale, the last thing the North Vietnamese needed was Stockdale dead. Stockdale never tapped his philosophy, never preached. If his colleagues were doing okay, he knew that they had their own philosophy and were applying it. He kept his stoic philosophy to himself, but, in addition to his incredible bravery, it was his philosophy which kept him going. He later recalled that, "I whispered a chant to myself as I was marched at gunpoint to my daily interrogation. Control fear, control guilt. Control fear, control guilt." He was released on February the 12th, 1973, during Operation Homecoming, among the first POWs repatriated following the Paris Peace Accords. He was promoted Rear Admiral and was presented with his Medal of Honor by President Gerald Ford in March 1976. Stockdale led an active life after retirement, first as president of the Citadel Military College, South Carolina, and later running as vice presidential candidate in 1992. In 1984, he and his wife published an account of their relationship and his time as a POW, In Love and War. James Woods depicted Stockdale in the film based on the book, made in 1987. Well, thank you, Murray, for writing that episode for us. If you would like to write an episode, or would like to contact us with regards to a subject that you think we might not have covered, but you'd like to hear covered, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.